Okay, so with that, like I said, welcome to our seminar on to postdoc or not to postdoc. So a little bit about me, just like who am I to tell you about postdocs? Um, well, I did do a postdoc. So how did I get there? I did for undergrad, I did biochemistry and molecular biology. And the reason I chose that is because I was really interested in research, even as an undergrad. I wanted to develop new medicines. Just that sounded really cool to me. That is what I wanted to do. So, based on that, not surprisingly, for my PhD, I decided to study pharmacology, which is all about understanding how drugs in the body interact. Um, I definitely went into my PhD thinking I would end up in a more industry focused position where I would be closer to like a patient outcome. But then through my PhD, things change. A PhD takes a while, so your career goals, not surprisingly, change throughout the 5 or 6 years you're in your PhD. In addition, I figured out during my PhD that I really liked teaching and I really liked mentoring. So if you take research and you take teaching and you combine those two things together, what job do you come up with? A tenure track faculty position. So I was like, okay, I guess that's what I want to do, even though I wasn't like totally sold on that. It was at least something that I had on my radar. So because of that, I was like, well, if I'm considering a tenure track faculty, I should probably do a postdoc. So I did. I came back here to Colorado and I did a postdoc here at CU Anschutz in cell and developmental biology. And during my postdoc, I was really involved with things on campus. I was super involved with the postdoc association and got to do a bunch of like outreach and other teaching experiences and leadership experiences. And through that, I really figured out that teaching and mentoring was really where my true passion lied. And I was at this point more okay with like stepping back from the bench piece and just focusing on like the teaching and instructional piece. So I'm skipping a few steps in my career here and just magically ended up here at the career development office. So now I teach things like this, like, should you do a postdoc or not? And I help you guys figure out what is the next step in your career and what is the best thing to do to set yourself up for success. So just a little bit about me. Okay. So that's just a little bit about us. Learning objectives for today ever so quickly. We're just going to talk about like what is a postdoc. I think most of you probably have a good idea of what a postdoc is, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. And also talk about how a postdoc might look different in different settings besides your classic academic postdoc. We're going to look at a bunch of data. There's all sorts of interesting studies about different metrics around postdocs, if they're effective, what they're good for, that type of a thing. We're going to think about what types of careers is a postdoc like necessary for versus beneficial. And then we're going to think about strategies to find a postdoc that aligns with your career goals if you've decided a postdoc is the right choice for you. And then once you are a postdoc, how to make sure you're setting yourself up for a successful postdoc. Okay. And I want to reiterate, if you guys have questions at any time, you guys raise your hands. Zoom people, it would be better if you could type in the chat just because I can see the chat, but I can't see all of you right now. So if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat. Okay, so to start, what is a postdoc? So according to the National Postdoc Association, the official dictionary definition of a postdoc is an individual holding a doctoral degree who's engaged in a temporary period of mentored research and or scholarly training for the purpose of acquiring the professional skills needed to pursue a career path of his or her choosing. So when I read that, there's a couple things that really pop out to me. First off, this is temporary. No one should be a postdoc forever. So this is by definition a short-term solution. This is not your long-term goal. It's also mentored. So yes, you are going to be more independent than a PhD student, but you are still under the advisement of a more senior scientist, so a PI. And then finally, acquiring the professional skills needed. So you are being trained. You should be gaining new skills. You are not just a highly skilled scientist who's expected to just like nose to the grindstone and get research done by yourself. Like you are supposed to be learning new things under sort of a structured, mentored environment. Okay, so that is our official definition of a postdoc. So I like to think temporary, once again, can be not just PhDs, it could be other terminal degrees, so like PharmDs, sometimes MDs, they're like research MDs might also do a postdoc potentially. At our institution, a postdoc is limited to 5 years. That is 5 years here as a postdoc. So technically you could do a postdoc somewhere else and then come here to just like do lots of postdoc. I would say just in your heart, let's all just set a limit of 5 years. regardless of institution, because of that temporary piece, if possible. And then this is actually from our CU Anschutz postdoc policy, which, oh, I should mention in the slides at the end, there's like a bunch of links that I will share with you guys, including a link to the CU Anschutz postdoc policy if you're just curious what the university's policy is. So I like this quote here: expected to be actively engaged in their career development and to seek out opportunities to acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to transition to their chosen career. So that is literally like within the policy for postdocs at our institution. And I would say that's true of a lot of institutions. So it's kind of baked in that there should be some sort of career development activity involved in being a postdoc. In other words, it should be more than just your research. There should be some amount of time spent to helping you get to that next step. I believe correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, the NPA guideline is 10%. So essentially, the National Postdoc Association and the NIH both acknowledge or both recommend 10% protected time for career development. That can be things like this. That can also be things like writing your own grants or mentoring students, things that are related to your career trajectory and are in addition to like research per se. So that should be baked in to your time as a postdoc. Bruce, I wonder if I should just give you my other headphone awkwardly. Is that gross? Okay, we're not going to do that. Okay. So I mentioned before, of course, we have our classic academic postdoc, but you could postdoc other places besides academia as well. But what would that look like if you decided to do a postdoc in academia? Like we said, that'd be full-time research, mentored under a PI. Once again, your goal is to learn new skills that further your career goals. Within academia, the focus in a postdoc often is on publications and grant writing, and then also on developing your own independent research program, meaning a project that you could take with you if you were to pursue a tenure track faculty position. Obviously, not everyone is interested in that, so that's not like a requirement or something in order for you to be a successful postdoc, but that should be something that should be an option to you as a postdoc, is the ability to take something with you if you were to try to start your own lab. How are academic postdocs funded? There's a variety of mechanisms. You could be funded directly off your PI's funding, so off an R01, for example. You could be funded off a training grant, like a T32. The university has a number of training grants. You can look up by institution, like which universities have training grants that support postdocs within your discipline. That's a way you can find postdocs. Or, of course, you could write your own grants and get your own funding, like through an F32, which is like an NRSA, but for postdocs. Usually, academic postdocs are paid according to the NIH guidelines. Those are the guidelines that are for T32, or sorry, for F32s. Some institutions might pay more, especially if you're in a more expensive city. But in general, you can look up that NIH guidance and kind of see where that salary lies. That should be, for most universities, the minimum, I would say. And then just so you know, here at CU Anschutz, the average postdoc is here for 2.5 years, just to give you an idea. Yeah, question? Right. The question was, if you get an F grant, when should be longer than 2.5 years? Totally. So that would tell you that probably not everyone is on that path or like wants to pursue an F32 or something like that. Obviously, if you get funding, then that gives you the opportunity to potentially stay longer. So that's our average. Yeah. Okay. In addition to academic postdocs, there are also postdocs you could do within the government. I will mention right now, government positions. But the NIH at least has resumed recruiting postdocs. So that hiring mechanism is open again. Yeah, you can decide like, do I want to do that right now? That's up to you. But there are a number of different government institutions that have postdoc fellowships. This is going to look very similar to academia. You will be in someone's lab doing full-time research under the guidance of a PI. One of the differences is usually in a government postdoc, there's less expectation that you have to write grants because in general, government-funded research doesn't have to write quite as many grants because they just have different funding mechanisms. But you'll still be writing. Generally, you still have that same expectation to publish as you would in an academic postdoc. Um, oh, and then I skipped the most important one, not the most important one, a nice perk. Generally, government postdocs do pay a little bit better than academic postdocs. Not like tremendously, but they do. I think the NIH, like if you're a postdoc at NIH, I think that minimum is 68 right now, whereas the NIH like F32 minimum 61. That's in part because some of these areas are more expensive. Like it's more expensive to live in the DC, Maryland area where the NIH is. So, if you are interested in a government postdoc, where can you find those? You can look through USA Jobs. You can look at specific agencies, or there's ORISE, which is the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education, which is essentially like a training arm within the federal government, and they list a lot of postdoc and other fellowship opportunities. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, those are definitely the places to look. Yes, question. Yeah. So the question was in academia, a lot of times you can like cold call or cold email a PI and ask if they have room. Can you do that in government postdocs? Um, I would say so. Government funding just works a little bit differently. I do feel like there are more advertised postdocs within government. But Bruce, do you feel like you've heard of anyone who's just cold called someone and gotten a postdoc position? I was saying, of course, it never hurts to email the PI. Do that anyway, but it might be less fun for sure. So, uh, in summary, if you're interested in a specific lab, reach out to them. Always good advice. Okay, sorry, I keep clicking away. And then finally, industry postdocs. So there are postdoc positions within private companies. So within pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies. I can you guys see that on my end? That's like super tiny. Um, but essentially, these are still research, 100% research positions. Oftentimes, there is still an expectation that you publish within these positions. I think sometimes the way the companies use these postdocs is to sort of like bolster their science and their research programs and get some publications out so that they are current in the field. So they're hiring people who are, recently minted scientists who are very good at producing publications and doing this work. And so that's sort of the benefit you are bringing to industry. And then, of course, the benefit industry brings to you is you're getting hands-on experience within industry. You're going to learn more about like the business side of science. You're going to network with people in industry. Some places say it can help you get hired as in a temporary or in a permanent position after you were finished with a postdoc. Other nice things about industry postdocs, they do tend to pay better than academic or government postdocs. Usually it's going to be more competitive to like a scientist position. So it's usually significantly better. And they also tend to be fixed duration. So you might be hired for like 2 or 3 years. Sometimes those can be prolonged. So you can like sign up for a second contract or something like that. But that can be kind of nice sometimes to know that you're signing on for a specific amount of time. I would say that these types of postdocs tend to be concentrated within specific companies. It's not like every, little startup company has a postdoc program, but there are some major players who have really robust postdoc programs like AstraZeneca, Merck, Amgen, et cetera. The list I will send out will have, or the slides I send out will have that full list of additional companies that have postdoc programs. If you are interested in one of those, I recommend going directly to that company's website and just looking at their career page, looking at their postdoc page. A lot of times they'll tell you like when applications open for those programs and things like that. I think you'll have more success finding those positions that way than trying to find them on a job board, just because usually these are enrolling at like a specific time of year, so you don't want to miss it. So if you're thinking about that, I would make sure you've given yourself enough runway to kind of plan in advance for an application cycle. Okay, so that's what is a postdoc. We got it. Cool. Let's look at some fun data because we're all scientists, and so we love to look at data. So what can we learn about some data from postdocs? So the truth is in uh, life sciences, so in our field, most PhDs do a postdoc. So this is data from the NSF survey of earned doctorates. So after you finish your PhD, you will get this survey from the NSF to ask you about like, hey, what are you doing now that you have finished your PhD? And then your data gets to go into the survey of earned doctorates. Cool. So you can see from this that life sciences, which is the the blue or like blue line here, green line, one of these lines. It's around 60 to 70% over time, hasn't really changed too much. It goes up, it comes down, it's somewhere around there. As you can see also, they're much more common to do postdocs in life sciences than other fields like humanities. Postdocs are less common over there. Within life sciences, most people are doing academic postdocs. So about 72% of people are doing academic postdocs and 20% are doing non-academic postdocs, meaning like an industry postdoc or a government postdoc. What are the other 8%? I think those are just like other, or maybe a combination of both types of postdocs, something like that. So I told you here at CU Anschutz, our average postdoc is about 2.5 years. Nationally, the average postdoc is about 3 years. That's 37.3 months. And then where do postdocs end up? So this graph, the top one is postdocs who did a postdoc in an academic position, so academic postdocs. And then down here, this is non-academic. So those non-academic postdocs, they have combined industry postdocs and government postdocs together. So not surprisingly, people who do academic postdocs are more likely to end up in academic positions. So 39% of those postdocs end up in faculty positions, 23% end up in non-faculty positions within academia. So that could be maybe like an instructor or a core facility or an administrator, something along those lines. So still within academia, but not at a tenure track position. Whereas if you look at the non-academic postdocs, 27% of them end up in, sorry, I think I wrote that wrong. 27% of them end up in academia. So even if you do an industry postdoc, academia can still be open to you. It doesn't mean that you have closed the door on academia forever. You could come back, and roughly a quarter of people do come back. But then a much bigger percent end up in industry jobs. I think that's 34%. It's too small for me to read, and I definitely wrote the wrong numbers there. So sorry for that, guys. Okay, so do you really need to do a postdoc though? I think that's one of the big questions. Is like, if I decide not to do a postdoc, is it going to harm me? Is it going to harm my chances to go where I want to go? So the answer to that question is it's going to depend on what your goals are, like what career you want. So if you want to go to a tenure track position, you can see here, this is percentages. So 10% of people in tenure track positions didn't do a postdoc, so it's possible. I would say that's also highly field dependent. So if you are wondering, like, why can't I just go straight from my PhD to applying for faculty positions? My answer to you would be look around your department and look at the new faculty hired within your department. Did those new faculty all do postdocs? Because if they did, that means if you want to be faculty, you're going to need to do a postdoc. But if you look around and there's a mix and some people didn't do postdocs and they came straight from their PhD, then that tells you that, okay, in my field, I might be able to go straight. And there are some fields that are able to go straight from PhD into a faculty position. I would say if you're in one of the basic science fields, that's probably not you. That tends to be, I would say, more like clinical research type fields. So 10% of people in tenure track positions did a postdoc, whereas this is saying 30%, or sorry, 30% did a postdoc, 10% did not. Whereas if you look in industry, that kind of flips a little bit. So within industry, there are more people who did not do a postdoc. So this is saying somewhere like 45%. And then like, I don't know, 35% of people did do a postdoc. So it is more common for people in industry to have not done a postdoc. But as you can see, there are plenty of people who end up in industry who did postdoc. So it's not like it's going to necessarily harm you. But as you can see, as opposed to academia, where you really need that postdoc to make yourself competitive, you probably don't really, you might not really need it in industry. So the question in the chat, what are some reasons for pursuing an industry postdoc but going back to academia? I think that depends on what happens during your industry postdoc. So in all postdocs, you're doing a lot of research, so including in industry. One of the articles I am linking for you guys, one of the people interviewed did this. She went back and went into academia, and it's partially because out of her research in her industry postdoc, they came up with this like assay or some sort of new testing, and then a university recruited her to come work in their department because they were like, we really want this within our department. And so she said, oh, okay. So I think that's one option. I think also someone you might go into industry and decide you don't really, it's not for you, that you liked academia better. So that's good to know. You got to experience industry. You also got to get paid more while you were an industry postdoc. And then you also generally get to still publish them while you are an industry postdoc. So you could still be competitive to try to get back into academia. So just some possible reasons why someone might go back. Okay. So if you're like Googling things about postdocs, if you were on Twitter, if you were on postdoc Twitter in 2017, everyone was just losing their mind over this study. I was on postdoc Twitter in 2017, so I saw about this a lot, but this was all about like, quote, the opportunity cost of a postdoc. So the way that the authors of this study did this is they looked at a bunch of salary data for people who had done postdocs and people who had not, and they followed them over time. And then they did some mathematical modeling to try to show essentially would someone who, like the same person, if they did or did not do a postdoc, would they ever like make up that gap in salary for the time when they were a postdoc? Because obviously, I mean, a postdoc is, you're getting paid better than a PhD student, but you're getting paid less than a scientist in industry, for example. So the question is like, how long does it take you to catch up? And do you ever surpass that person? So some quotes from this study. People who started in postdocs, the median annual starting salary during their first 4 years after their PhD was $44,000, and compared with $73,000 for those who entered the workforce directly. Once again, this study was from 2017, so if those numbers feel low to you, that's inflation. But that gives you an idea of just the financial truths. And then these studies would suggest that it takes somewhere around 10 to 15 years to, quote, catch up with non-postdoc peers. So I show you this data to be transparent. This is the data. I am not trying to persuade you one way or another to pick a postdoc or not pick a postdoc, to suck it up and take a lower salary because you need to, or to say, no, I'm not doing a postdoc because I want to make more. That is a decision that you have to make for yourself, and that is going to be based on your career goals. But I think it's important as you are considering that decision to have all of the information and to know, like, okay, is that something that I am willing to consider and willing to kind of compromise on? Because I think this is something that is a compromise. Any questions on this? Once again, I will link the link is in the slides if you want to read the whole study. Bruce was saying for those on Zoom that essentially there is more to consider than just salary. Also, different sectors have different pay rates. So like if you are a tenure track faculty, you're probably going to make less than someone in industry in general. But kind of considering this salary compromise is important to understand as you're also thinking about the additional training you need in order to, achieve the career that you want. So all things to consider as you are thinking about a postdoc. Okay, other considerations. So obviously things right now in the current climate are a little uncertain. There was a recent survey from the National Postdoc Association. They did a survey of 300 postdocs, and not a huge sample size, but it just came out in March, where they were just asking, like, hey, have you been impacted by all the recent things that have been going on with the administration? In their survey, 54% of those postdocs said that they were impacted in some way. So that could mean like a funding freeze, a grant cancellation. Maybe they decided not to submit a grant that they were going to, some sort of impact. So that definitely is a real thing that has happened. But like I said, the NIH is also still recruiting postdocs. They just came back to say, like, yes, we have resumed recruiting of postdocs. As we are thinking about how things are right now, I like to reiterate that things might seem and are tumultuous and stressful right now, but I have confidence that science will still exist. And if science still exists, postdocs will still exist, because postdocs are a vital component of how research works, not just in the United States, but in the whole world. So I have confidence that postdocs will still exist, even if you're like a second year PhD student and you're not thinking about a postdoc for a while. There will still be postdocs. Is funding maybe going to be a little tighter for the next year or two? Maybe. But I think that's probably going to be true in lots of sectors. So I guess the takeaway is the uncertainty is real and the anxiety is real, but also, like, I think I really, really believe you still will have a chance to have a postdoc. And I don't want anyone to let what's happening in the political climate like not be a factor to make you not pursue your dreams and be like, I really want to be in this career, and then say I'm not going to do it because of this specific administration. That would suck. Don't let them do that to you. So, okay, that's my soapbox. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, it's a good question. The question was, are recent graduates maybe shifting away from postdocs and trying to go into industry? I would say the past few years, the trend in general has been more people going into industry. It's not like a humongous exodus, but that's, I would say, over the past few years, not just the past few months. Um, the closest data I can show you for the past few months is data from our campus, how many new postdocs we have hired as a campus. So in Q1 of 2024, so from January to April, there were 31 postdocs hired. And these were new postdocs, so not just people who didn't do their PhD here, just in case there were people who like stayed for a month or two to finish up projects. Tried to exclude that population just in case. We had 31 new postdocs, 43 postdocs total in that time. This year, from January to April, we actually hired 38 new postdocs, or 44 total. So to me, it seems like at least no huge changes yet. But once again, it's only been a couple months, so I think it's honestly too soon to tell. Yeah, it could. So the chill doesn't mean no hiring at all. So postdocs, if you can make a reason why you need that postdoc, there are still people who are onboarding new postdocs. Bruce, what Bruce said about the hiring of postdocs is if you already have a grant and it's that money has been approved and you have been approved to hire a postdoc, like that money's already been approved for hiring that postdoc. So there are still labs who are hiring postdocs right now, even if there's a hiring chill. Yeah, I think another wrinkle too is the job market is tough, and it has been for the past like 2 years. That also makes it harder to get a job in industry. Then that's like kind of a motivation to maybe be like, okay, well, maybe I'll do a postdoc, gain some new skills, wait it out a couple years, and then try again. So it's like there's two warring forces, I think. But it'll be interesting to see over the next year or so how those trends change. Okay. So that being said, I wish I could make my doc go away. I could, but I'm not going to. Um, what are some good reasons to do a postdoc? I would say if you are considering an academic career, like I mentioned, I was considering a tenure track faculty career. In that case, I would say you should do a postdoc. The reason for that is if you really want to be a faculty member, a postdoc is almost certainly part of that path. And if that's part of your plans potentially, then you want to make sure you're setting yourself up to achieve that goal. So that is a good reason to do a postdoc. If you are not interested in an academic career, there are still good reasons to do a postdoc. For example, maybe you strategically are looking to gain some skills that might help you get a job in industry or a job in clinical research management or something like that. I know someone asked when they registered that they were interested in maybe getting into like clinical research or clinical trials management. Let's say you're doing a PhD in a very basic science right now. If you did a PhD with a clinician scientist who is clinically currently doing clinical trials, you can see how that could potentially help you break into that field. So even though in that case you're not necessarily interested in an academic career, you are once again gaining skills that are helping you get to that career goal. Another good reason to do a postdoc is you want to move to like a new city or a new location, and you want to meet some people in that market. So, for example, let's say you want to move to Boston. There's tons of industry companies in Boston, and you want to work in industry. So you're applying to jobs in Boston, but you're having a hard time getting hired. You're not local. So, of doing a short postdoc and even an academic postdoc where you can purposely network with people in that region, that's a good reason to do a postdoc. Now you are more likely to get hired because you're in that city, for one. Two, you know people because you've networked. And three, hopefully you've picked a lab where you can gain additional skills that are going to make you more marketable within that industry. So that's another good reason. So then another example, oh, I did give some specific examples. Bruce, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, I feel like it's similar to so a medical science liaison is someone who's kind of at the interface between science and like practicing clinicians. So similar thing, if that's something that's interesting to you, but you don't have clinical experience, doing a postdoc in a lab that does have a clinical arm is going to help you, especially if it's something where you can actually interface with other physician scientists and start to meet some of those key opinion leaders. In other words, like leaders in the field. Um, that's another way. Bruce is saying if you, let's say, want to become a medical science liaison, so you're doing a postdoc in a place where you can network with physicians and other providers, that's a great reason to do a postdoc. That's a postdoc that's probably going to be shorter. Maybe it's like 2 years that you can quickly transition into that career. So those are some good reasons to do a postdoc. And I'm going to go back actually and just say one more too. Um, there's other things that are like outside of your career. So for example, maybe you want to stay in the Denver area because you have a partner who has a job here. And so maybe part of your reason is like, I want to stay here. I want some more time. Like Bruce mentioned this, I want some more time to look for jobs in this market. And so I want to do a postdoc so I have some more time. That's a totally fine reason to do a postdoc. Like that is a personal like value decision. And that's also a fine reason to do a postdoc. But same thing, I would still go in with like specific career goals and what are you hoping to get out of that postdoc, and don't just like pick whatever comes up first, but try to be strategic about the postdoc that you are selecting to set yourself up for success. Okay, so some less good reasons to do a postdoc. Someone mentioned when we talked about like, what do you think of when you think of postdoc? Like forever student. And you're like, I just want to be more student. That's not a great reason to do a postdoc, like trying to avoid the real world. You don't know what to do next. So you just are like, I don't really know what I want to do when I grow up. I haven't decided what I'm doing with this PhD. I'm just going to do a default postdoc. I would discourage you from doing that because, like I said, I want all of you guys by the time you've finished your PhD to have at least some idea of what you want to do. Because if you do a default postdoc, then you're just going to putting off that decision longer. At some point, you're going to have to decide what you're going to do. So just decide that now. So take home message is really, if I haven't harped on this enough so far, like you really need to do some sort of career planning and career exploration and just narrowing down your options before you graduate so that you can decide if you want to do a postdoc or so that you can pursue whatever that next step is going to be. Okay, so let's say you have now decided you are going to do a postdoc. What does that look like? What are some steps here? So step one, like I said, you have to first figure out your goals. So what are your long-term career goals? There are some kind of questions you could ask yourself here. What are some skills and experience you need in order to achieve those long-term career goals? Is a postdoc required? Like, do you absolutely have to have a postdoc for your career goal, or is it just a benefit? Is it just a way to gain skills? Those are all good things to know. And then do you need to have an independent research program that you can take with you? That's important to know from the start because that's something you want to talk about with your postdoc mentor really from the get-go. Like, I want to have something I can take with me after I leave. So of course, in order to answer a lot of those questions, you have to know what those long-term career goals are. Of course, you plug for Career Development Office. We help you with that. If you're not sure what those goals are, come talk to us. So then the idea is once you've done that assessment and you've kind of identified what are the skills that you need, sort of what are the requirements you're looking for, then you can use that to help choose a postdoc that's going to help you build those new skills. Okay, so now once you have identified the skills you need, how do you actually find postdocs? We already mentioned this, but at least in academic postdocs, most people actually find postdocs through like non-advertised means. So this would be for academic postdocs, not necessarily industry or government postdocs, but for academic postdocs, most of the time someone is like emailing the PI and being like, hey, I met you at a conference and we had a really great discussion and I would love to talk more about your project. I'm curious if you have room in your lab to, continue to expand upon this, something like that. So that is definitely a huge way or a huge avenue to find postdocs. How do you find those people to email? Of course, like I said, networking at conferences. Also ask your mentor, ask other faculty in your department, especially if you are wanting a postdoc that's maybe, for example, like with a clinician scientist, someone who has 1 foot in research and 1 foot in the clinic, and that's not your world at all. That's a place where you're really going to need to maybe leverage your network and the university's network and start asking people like, hey, do you know anyone like this? And they might say, oh, well, I don't, but over here, I think they know some people, and that can help you find some of those connections. Of course, you can also look up universities that have T32 training grants for postdocs. So that's just a funding mechanism. So for example, this map is a map of NIMH training grants throughout the country. So that's a way to potentially find postdocs within your discipline. And then if you're interested in a specific location, of course, you can just look at that university's website and go through the labs and then just truly cold email people. And then here at CU Anschutz, we have a postdoc specific job board. So what this is it's PIs on campus who are looking for a postdoc, but it's kind of in a more casual way. So they haven't like fully made a job posting yet, but it's like, hey, I have an idea for a project and I'm kind of looking for a postdoc. So it's kind of that first conversation. So that's really helpful if you maybe want to stay on campus to look at the opportunities that are on that job board. Once again, the link is in the slides that I'll send to you. Okay, so then once you have found that postdoc and you've applied, how do you set yourself up for success to have a really strong postdoc that gives you those skills that you need to transition? I would say there's kind of two phases or two sub-phases of this. There's setting yourself up during the interview, and then also once you've started that postdoc. So during the interview, you definitely want to be asking questions to the mentor and to the lab to make sure that you are finding a good fit for both your research and your career goals. So depending on what those career goals are, it's going to be important to just ask if that mentor, is able to support you in the way that you're looking. If you're looking especially for something specific, like the ability to go to rounds and things like that. I also encourage you to communicate your goals with your potential PI early on. So for example, if you're like, I really want to get into clinical research, or I really want to be a medical science liaison, that's something you should be telling your PI, your potential postdoc PI mentor upfront. Don't try to just say oh, I want to go into a tenure track and then get there and be like, no, just kidding. Because that's the best way to know that you're going to have a mentor who's going to be supportive of you. Similarly, it's also good to ask what can I take with you? What is the history of people taking projects with them if they decide to start their own labs and go tenure track? And then of course, asking where other previous postdocs have ended up. So other postdocs from those labs, where are they now? Do they have a history of getting into the types of positions you want to get into? That is a great thing to hear if they do, because now that shows you that mentor is good at mentoring postdocs in those positions, but also you have a built-in network now within that position as well. They even can give you hopefully a list of previous trainees, and then you can connect with them even on LinkedIn or something and just ask about what the environment was like in the lab is a good idea too. And then another thing to consider is what are the supports like on campus for postdocs? So for example, here at CU Anschutz, there's a postdoc association and a postdoc office that help support postdocs. I would say most larger institutions will have some sort of postdoc office, but it's worth looking into and just knowing are you going to be one of 10 postdocs on campus, or is there a pretty robust postdoc community there? So then now you've interviewed, you got the position. Oh, okay, there's a question in the chat. Is it common to bring a project with you to your postdoc? I would say no, not really. I think it depends on your field a lot also, how common that would be. Because I would say you definitely could bring some ideas that make sense within your mentor's research program. But I would say it's not very common to have to come with completely your own independent project to bring to live under the lab of a different person. Yeah. So Bruce mentioned there is a transition award sort of from a PhD to a postdoc that some institutes have at NIH. So you might have heard of before a K99R00, which is for a postdoc who's trying to transition into a faculty position. This is sort of analogous, but for a PhD student who's transitioning into a postdoc. So you get the funding as a PhD student, and then you take it with you when you become a postdoc. I would say this is not a super common funding mechanism. I think there's maybe only 2 agencies who are currently funding it. I do have a link to it in the resources somewhere if you are curious about that. I think there's also some private organizations who fund similar transition awards. But in general, I would say that is uncommon. Most people are expected to bring ideas and like technical skills, the ability to learn quickly, the ability to kind of like figure things out. You're not necessarily expected to like come in day one with your own research project. But of course, it's something you would talk about with the PI. Okay, so then once you are in that postdoc, how do you continue to set yourself up for your success once you've started? You've already talked to your PI about your career goals because you talked about that in the interview. So it's going to make sense to set some really clear goals around your career goals with your PI early. A great way to do that is through individual development plans. Technically, the NIH encourages or requires all trainees to use IDPs, but that's not really like checked on in any way, but it is there. So in theory, you should be doing an IDP as a postdoc regardless. So this is just a framework that provides a structured way to set some research goals and some professional goals at the same time. So they're good conversations to have early, and I would say maybe like quarterly with your mentor, just to make sure that you are on track to meet those goals. Of course, take advantage of career development opportunities, so networking, leadership, service, things that make sense, once again, for your career goals. So for example, if you are interested in a career in science communication, maybe you join Project Bridge and you take on a bigger role in like planning some events, things like that, because that makes sense within what you were trying to do for your career. And then I think it's also good as you are going along to kind of think about when you're going to be done. So like, how do you know you're done? It's different than a PhD where at some point, you're meeting with your committee every year and they're kind of talking about like, okay, are you done? Are you approaching doneness? And then at some point, people say, yes, you have completed it. You are done. There is no committee for your postdoc. There are no people who are going to say, you've done all the things you need to do. You can now move on. So how do you know you finished your postdoc? There's many things that could come in here. Of course, funding. At some point, you might have finished your grant, and so you're going to transition. There could also be metrics. Maybe you want a specific number of papers, or you wanted to get that K99, things like that. Or you're waiting until you get a position and your mentor is able to keep funding you until you find that long-term position. So it's good to just kind of keep in mind what you want that end goal to be, because unlike a PhD, no one's going to tell you necessarily, like, you've done it. You learned the things you needed to learn. I would say in general, if you feel like at some point you're not learning anymore in your postdoc, then that's a good indication that like maybe I shouldn't be a postdoc anymore. If you have you feel like now you're not learning, maybe you just feel like you're kind of helping run the lab and manage things. That could be a conversation to have with your PI. Maybe you could transition into a research position that's not necessarily a postdoc. So for example, on our campus, you could ask to transition to be a research associate. So that is a non-tenure track position. So it's not related to like a tenure clock, but it's 100% research. The pay might not be all that different from a postdoc, but you would get some better benefits like retirement and leave, things like that. So, and then also the flip side is there's no more of this expectation that you're learning new skills and like receiving this career training. So if at some point you're like, I don't feel like I'm actually needing that anymore, that could be a conversation to have of like, could I transition into a different job title so that at least you're showing like some career progression on your CV. So, okay. Oh, I went through all of that. Great. So to wrap up, and then I'll give you guys a chance for questions. Of course, Bruce and I, we're here to help you. The Career Development Office, that's what we do. Those are our pictures. Especially if you are feeling not as confident about what is going to come after your training, we have a whole program for that. It's called iSearch, Individual Career Exploration Research. So really the idea here is it's a series of workshops where you're going to do like some personality assessments, some like career exploration. You're going to do informational interviews. We do like a career panel, go out to a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company and like see what the company's like. So you're really doing like kind of some structured career exploration. So if you feel like on that slider you were like 2 or less, iSearch could be a good fit for you to just help narrow down some of those choices to think about what could be next. I'm not saying that you have to like have one thing, like I know I want to do this, but at the very least, I recommend narrowing it down to like 2 or 3 things. Otherwise, it's hard to plan for like 10 potential careers because then, yeah, it's hard to know what skills you really need to focus on. Okay, so with that, um, yeah, so there's a Jennifer, you can if you have questions in general about like your own specific situations and like different careers you are weighing and you want advice on like, do you think this is a better fit for me? Do you think I should do a postdoc based on my needs and like what I'm interested in and you want someone to talk to about it? We are also here for that. You can set up one-on-one appointments through Handshake and we're happy to talk to you about all of that stuff. Okay, so with that, what questions do you guys have, if any? I'm gonna bring up this tiny slide. Like I said, here's all the links. Here's all the questions that were asked in registration. Obviously, you can read that. I feel like we went through most of these. There was one question that was something like, is it a good idea to apply for a postdoc while I'm waiting to apply to industry? And I guess my question is, why are you waiting to apply to industry? If you feel like you know you want to be in an industry scientist position, you don't necessarily need a postdoc for that. It could help. So if that's where you're at, I would encourage you to apply to those industry positions. And maybe also you might discover that you have a skills gap that a postdoc could help you with. But I wouldn't feel like you have to do a postdoc first. If you feel like you want to go into industry, you can definitely apply to those jobs as a PhD. You don't need to wait. And I would say there was a question in the chat about when should you start writing and applying to grants as a postdoc? Really, the answer is like you hit the ground running on that, depending on well, also like depending on your goals. Obviously, I'm assuming if you want to go your tenure track faculty route, where grant funding is going to be especially important, definitely within your first year, you should be submitting like an F-32. You're only eligible for 2 years. Is that true for all agencies? Really change that. Okay. But you're not eligible for all postdoc funding mechanisms forever because once again, they are temporary positions. So the NIH is trying to like discourage eighth year postdocs. Also because that's not a fair competition, like an eighth year postdoc versus a first year postdoc. So tend to be time limits on those. If you're thinking like a K-99, a good time to start thinking about that, I would say probably be around like year 3. I would say is probably somewhere around the average of when people start thinking about writing those grants. But that's also something you should talk to with that PI during your interview and just make sure they have a good expectation of like when you're going to start submitting grants. And also make sure that they have a good history of helping their trainees get successful funding. Yeah. Mm, yeah, good question. The question is what would be the motivation to do an industry postdoc versus just an entry level industry position? Um, I think there are a couple reasons. I think for one, absolutely, you can just go into industry if you can get a position and just start working as a scientist. As an industry postdoc, I think in general, you tend to do a little bit more maybe like research and also publications where you might not be publishing in a regular industry position. That's a generalization, I would say. In general, most of those postdoc programs through industry do have an expectation that you are publishing in some capacity, whereas that might not be an expectation if you are a scientist too, or something like that. So if that's something that feels important to you, then that can be beneficial. In terms of like, does it help you advance into like a higher place within the company if you were to get hired as a postdoc? I think that varies. As far as I know, the data on hiring industry postdocs is not like it's not like it's not like you're set once you get that industry postdoc. I think it's still competitive. It's a competitive field regardless. Um, so I don't know. I would say in general, I feel like the advice I've heard is kind of pros and cons on industry postdocs. Some people have the opinion that it's better to just get a scientist position. And I think some people are of the opinion that you're getting additional training within industry. So it could in the future make you more competitive to say like lead the research team down the line. Bruce is adding that in industry postdocs, because you're a postdoc, you're going to get more like training and development than you would as necessarily a new employee. So Bruce shared an anecdote about a friend who did an industry postdoc, hoping to get a job at that company. And then the company was like, JK, we don't hire any of our postdocs. So worth asking when you interview. Does that help a little bit? Okay, great. All right. Well, then if there's no further questions, please reach out if you have any questions. And thank you all for joining today. Like I said, I'll send out the slides that have all those nice resources. You can really fall down the rabbit hole about all the different postdoc data. And please come talk to us if you have questions about postdocs.